Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I don't recognize myself in those words. You're too kind. Well, thanks all of you for attending this Tropilunch. It's been a while since I myself was at one of these esteemed events, as in, I think Renata just said 14 years. So it's probably something along those lines. It's been a while, and could hardly imagine back then that this would be done virtually via Zoom. It seems like that technology just wasn't really available. So what a difference a decade plus makes. Yeah, to me, the Tropilunch and the events at TCD were sort of kind of I don't know, one of the most formative experiences that I had in graduate school. So in part the opportunity to share and to learn from so many different uh, in disciplinary traditions, from the diversity of work, of research that was being done on campus and elsewhere. So I think it's probably, I hope it's somewhat fitting that I take on a subject that's kind of cross-disciplinary in nature, transdisciplinary. I know the terms of art change every year, but I'm hoping that you will view this as an opportunity to engage with me. I hope I won't speak too long. I have a tendency to do that. So stop me at any point. And yeah, I'd like to have a robust discussion later, if at all possible. I think this is an hour long, right? Okay. So I'll try to give some space after I present. So the title of this talk is Cross Currents, and really it's just an effort to try to speak between folks in the media world and researchers. And most of the folks at TCD and Tropical Conservation Development are somewhere in the socio-ecological continuum. I was myself when I was in graduate school and a postdoc, and now I find myself more in the media realm. So I'm kind of spread all around. Um, but I think for a lot of folks, even though we're inherently sort of cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, we also still have these, boundary objects or these points of division between us. Obviously we define ourselves either as researchers or scientists, and those who are not researchers or scientists. And the same thing with in the media world, journalists define themselves as journalists, and those who are not journalists. And so we still have this tendency to differentiate. Um, and so I think that's kind of what I want to get at today. But I also want to be mindful of words. I know a lot of these things are just bandied about. I already talked about, we always have to have some sort of agreement on terms. In today's talk, when I use the word social-ecological, this could be so substitute for the environment. I think a lot of us are comfortable with that. And the shorthand scientists for research, and of course we'll get into why that's a little bit complicated at times. And also in terms of the word journalist, increasingly we have this idea of content creators and influencers that are sort of trending into this world of media. But I don't, for the purposes of this talk, I don't necessarily think that I'll go too much into that. So I do want to say that, I just want to put this out there. I know you didn't necessarily have an opportunity to speak back to me, but maybe just meditate on these questions. And maybe through my extrasensory perception, I can pick up on your answers. But show of hands, how many of you trust the news media to report accurately on science or other academic research? Let me see if I can see any hands up there. Okay. Okay, some hand waving. Okay. So some hands at least. And how many of you trust journalists to report accurately on specifically on environmental issues? Again, using this idea of environment to probably encompass everything that most of TCD works on these days. Any hands there? Okay, a lot of hand waving. One hand, I saw one hand go up there. That's great. Well, you're not without your skepticism and your caution is duly noted. There's a lot of research that has been published in the last several years about the issue of news media covering science. And this is a classic article here. News coverage of expert consensus on general matters of policy is likely limited as a result of journalists' emphasis in news production on novelty and drama at the expense of thematic context. the content is biased towards balance and conflict, right? Which weakens the persuasiveness of expert consensus. And you don't have to look at this; it's pretty boring. But basically, the gist of it is that false prevalence of false balance in issues and a lot of scientific issues. This also takes on economic issues. Is quite significant in as terms of percentage of stories. Things from like talking about GMO safety all the way down to this is prior to COVID, but all the way down to vaccines. The prevalence of polarizing opponents by issues. So that is putting opponents in oppositional frameworks and stories. Quite significant in many science-based type stories. And I think perhaps more surprisingly, that this trend has increased to a degree in the 2000s. It's at least in the polarizing sense, dripped off a little bit in 2010s. If more research were to be done subsequent to this, I think you'd find a significant increase in both false balance and polarizing opposition. You saw it during the pandemic. We find in this study, we find that politicians appear in newspaper coverage more frequently than scientists, whereas politicians and scientists are more equally featured in network news. Again, not to go too far into this, but essentially the gist of it is that politicians appear far more as experts in stories about public health, particularly in this case, COVID, far more so than scientists do. And that was even in the height of the pandemic, talking specifically about issues related to the spread of the virus and other technical and scientific related matters. Discrepancy in scientific authority and media visibility of climate change. Equated is a classic one. We're all familiar with this. Here we show a direct comparison that contrarians are featured in 49% more media articles than scientists. Yet when comparing visibility in mainstream media sources, we observe just a 1% excess visibility, which is interesting. But basically, the gist of that is that climate skeptics are hugely prevalent in all forms of media, slightly less so than quote unquote mainstream, and highly very disproportionate to to the actual factual basis of what they're purveying, right? Not just climate, and I think we have this tendency, the most oppositional, the most polarizing subjects are things like because we lived through COVID, public health related, the coronavirus itself, and of course climate change, which has been polarizing at least in North America, although throughout the world to some extent for decades. Even the biodiversity crisis, there's a sense that the media does not cover it particularly well. And this is a study in Conservation Action that said if not carefully navigated, messages around environmental degradation can lead to audience disengagement and issue fatigue at a time when motivation, engagement, and positive action is required. And they, of course, posited this framework for how to deal with it. But the bottom line being that there's a recognition that scientists are not breaking through the media, even on issues that are, well, let's just say, less au courant and topical as climate change and public health measures, at least to some degree. And it's not just a U.S. thing. I know there's this tendency to focus on the U.S. and North America for a lot of these studies. There's been a lot of work in Latin America about media portrayals of COVID-19, the pandemic writ large, especially in very popular programming in a place like Brazil, and throughout Latin America, there's a very healthy and vibrant fact-checking community that's focused on essentially fact-checking climate change dis and misinformation. But all of that is, to some degree, is founded and deeply rooted in the sense that there's at least a discrepancy, if not a distrust, between media and the scientific community. Last, I'll just say you're all in Florida. I'm not. I have to deal with wildfires. You deal with hurricanes there, but including the most recent one. But this is, this kind of demonstrates a similar, and I always say meteorology is kind of this interesting intersection between the media world and the scientific world, where, in some sense, meteorologists are seen as translators of scientific knowledge. And yet, nevertheless, there is this sort of, in this particular article, and what others like it, this sort of view and perception that there is very poor science communication taking place insofar that metaphors about hurricanes as monsters or as other threats using, very, I guess you could say, evocative metaphors at times prevents proper scientific information and research from being relayed. Now, why do I show you all that? I think, in some part, it's just stuff that you already knew, right? And then for most of the folks in the room, it's like, yeah, I guess I could have assumed that without looking into the statistics. But, what many researchers would sort of conclude from that is that on one level, there's a lack of scientific education on the part of journalists and other folks in the media. Um, Most journalists have a great difficulty interpreting research because they're not trained in those areas. There are exceptions, of course, but for the most part, many journalists come in to reporting on science and the environment either from a different beat or they may not have even majored anything remotely related to the topics that they covered in college, and so they inherently just have a greater challenge in interpretation of research, often very sophisticated research. Interviews. I mean, many of you, if not all of you, have probably been interviewed, even by the Daily Alligator reporter at UF. And I'm sure miscommunication during interviews is one of the striking experiences for those of you who were waving your hands earlier. Part of that's probably because of the sense that you were quoted out of context, or whatever the case may be. And that's obviously something that a lot of folks in the scientific community feel quite passionately about. I suppose their distrust of members of the media. And so there's a miscommunication during the interview, and of course, what's relayed after the interview. Perceived conflicts of interest. I think to some sense there's a lot of distrust of individuals in the media and how they cover science and their poor understanding of how things work, but also about what operating framework do they come from. And perhaps this is less of an issue now because press releases aren't as much of a thing, but reliance on verbatim press releases or information that's just spoon-fed to an individual member of the media rather than using their own critical analysis, critical thinking skills. From a journalist perspective, there is also some measure of criticism of scientists, though, right? I mean, let's take the devil's advocate position here. I hear this all the time in my work as an editor. Scientists hedge too much in the results. They're incessantly caught up in the weeds of nuance and detail, i.e., or e.g., they see no forest through the trees, no forest through the trees thinking. They take forever to do anything. They're too secretive, arrogant, or just condescending to non-academics. That doesn't happen in TCD, we all know, because we're this very demotic, down to earth group of people. But yes, it's true that is often a perception that scientists are arrogant and just condescending to those who are not like them. I think there's also, to some degree, and this is something that has recently come to my attention, that's something that just a lot of journalists and members of media are not familiar with, is that there's also a blind spot about the way that knowledge is produced in the ivory tower, and that it's it's not necessarily as all wonderful and hunky dory as it may initially appear. This is just a webinar that I attended recently on how to cover academic research fraud and errors. There is obviously this huge blind spot, I think, on the part of many in the journalistic community, not being able to understand that there's a whole lot of work that goes into that active knowledge production, and some of it's not always all that pleasant. And these are folks that devote themselves to identifying. They're all, I think, the woman on the top right is a former microbiologist, Elizabeth Bick, and the gentleman on the right is a member of Harvard's academic fraud watch unit, so on and so forth. But anyways, the point being that this is the type of thing that there actually is a discrepancy and a lack of knowledge on, at least on the media side of things. And this is just to say that this is, I think, an area that receives very little coverage because of the lack of communication or understanding, at least initially. And then, this is not to belabor the point, but this is from The Guardian, and this is sort of a classic piece that sort of explained this in a little more detail. But essentially, it went on to outline how scientists really don't understand, at least in how traditional media is created or produced, and essentially some very similar complaints that scientists want to tell the whole story. They want longer stories. They want boring headlines. They sound like robots. They think journalists are their PR agents. They want to include every caveat. They want to control the timing of their stories. They want to suppress criticism, and they want to correct every perceived error. Yet there's shared stakes, right? We all have shared stakes. And I think these can largely be categorized in three ways. Um, I think in both sense, members of the media and scientists. Again, I'm using this mimetic scientist to refer to a very large and diverse continuum, but nevertheless, both professions are driven by the passion for questioning assumptions, uncovering hidden narratives and revealing new knowledge to the world, right? Um, there is cooperation, I think, in both fields. Scientists and journalists face a wave of allegations around bias and fake news. This is increasing, and I'll show you that in a second. Um, by fake news, we of course mean dismiss and malinformation. We can go into those definitions later if you want. Um, and they both have certain interests and benefit for their publics. So by sharing the stories of their findings and stories using the word stories very generally. With accuracy and imagination, scientists and journalists can foster critical thinking, value vetted knowledge, and inspire search for a common humanity. That sounds a little touchy feely, but I think it is, in some sense, something that I think both domains really aspire to. Okay, this is pretty North America specific, but there are some international implications here. This just came out today, or came in my inbox today. Why millions of Americans avoid the news and what it means for the U.S. election. The basic idea that there's a new study that came out that 43% of Americans avoid the news entirely, and 32% distrust any media that isn't within their social media feeds. So that's, a very America specific perspective. But if you look at what the implications are for at least in the traditional legacy media approach, this is pretty significant, in that most people are, and this is a global scale. So the sample includes a number of European countries, but also Brazil, Australia, and I believe also Colombia. This is from the Reuters Institute in Oxford. And basically, the bottom line that most people are accessing their content, their media, entirely from their social media feeds and bypassing traditional media purveyors, almost to the tune of about roughly, if you looked at the numbers on this and how they break down, more than half in pretty much all the countries in the Reuters Institute survey. So that's pretty massive. And it obviously has significant implications because there's no longer, a sense that that journalists um, have very much weight and presence in their daily lives. But the same can also be said for scientists, right? I mean, so now we're talking about the discrepancies between scientists and journalists, and now very much from the public perception, and publics being, not only news audiences but also the society at large that benefits, or in other words, is party to science, and research that is produced. And so in this Pew Center study, some of you probably saw this last year that came out. Fewer Americans. Again, I don't have as good international results on this, but I think it's pretty reflective, at least in the European example, less so perhaps in Latin America. But anyway, so fewer Americans now say science has had a mostly positive effect on society. And since prior to the pandemic and after it, you can notice a very decided decline in that, at least whatever it is, 16 percentage points, from those who viewed science as mostly positive in 2016 to 57% in a much in a growing trend of those who view science as mostly negative, or equally positive and negative. So that's, you could say that that's the effect of COVID-19 and the pandemic and the polarization, the political polarization around that. But I think it bears reasoning, and there's some other studies that indicate that it's not exclusively the effect of the pandemic. So then we get to, so the shared, given these threats, the shared stakes that we do have as scientists and members of the media, I kind of reflect on I guess, seminal work that came out by these German researchers that talks about post-normal science communication. So there's this discussion um, after former President Trump came to office and when he was elected in 2016 about the need for a post-normal science, and then subsequent to that, a need for post-normal media landscape. And the idea is that in both ways, media and science are being challenged, right, by post-normal situations of coping with uncertainties, value questions, an urgency to take action, and associated political pressures, a dramatically changing media environment, as we discussed, and an extremely polarizing discourse culture. So, these are things that are quite present in my day-to-day work from what I see, but I can also see, reflecting back when I was doing more academic work, how this is also present, especially given the politicization of academic research and, again, primarily in the US, but not exclusively. So, situations where there's high uncertainty, there's questions about basic value of work that's being done. Stakes are very high. I mean, obviously, you're talking about people's jobs, their, you know, their essentially their identities, and ultimately the kinds of impact that their work may produce. All that comes into question. We already talked about changing media um, aspects of it. Post-normal science communication also operates in this realm in which societies are very polarized and there's extensive ideological conflicts. But at the same time, there are trends that are emanating from this. So there's this renegotiation of boundaries between what would be properly, I guess, historically conceived of as the impartial translator of objective work, as scientists often were seen as, right? There's a famous book by Roger Pilkey, that talks about this, especially in the realm of climate science, and then more towards this trend of scientists and journalists as advocates, and less so as merely just translating or regurgitating information. And this article goes into a number of reasons why this might be the case, but the bottom line being it sort of observes this trend, and in some sense, it's a call to action for why both journalists and scientists must operate in a post-normal context. Now, I don't want to get too much into this, but I do want to say, what to some degree the discrepancies, I think, are inseparable, but I also think that we shouldn't not try to understand why that's the case. So there's this whole idea from the science and technology studies world, and I'm not going to go too far into this, but just to say that these idea of meta discourses is what separates us. And these are, ways in which writers and speakers interact through their use of language with readers and listeners. So the meta discourse of journalism is often this idea of public expressions, evaluating news texts, the practices that produce them, or the conditions of their reception, right? So this is important for establishing shared meetings and understandings around, a news event. So this, of course, would be something that would be very important for a communicator, i.e. somebody in the media. And it's why, to some degree, scientists view it as being very simplistic or reducing nuance. And then compliments of Firefly AI, a philosopher chasing a scientist, not a very brilliant rendition, although I thought it was somewhat amusing. Scientists use meta discourses to organize their text, express their stance, and engage with their audience. So some examples of meta discourses are transitions, co-glosses, hedges, boosters, self-mentions, and attitude markers. So the way that they express themselves is inherently, and how research is done, is focusing on nuance and focusing on exceptions, and focusing on highly precise definitions and details, because that is the meta discourse of doing scientific work. Now, if we have a little more time, I'm running. I've already talked for almost half an hour, right? So if I have a little bit more time, I'll go into some other aspects of this that I think bear mentioning. But for the sake of moving on, I'd like to use some case studies of this and why I think this is really relevant to perhaps your work for many of you in the TCD community. And I think this will strike close to home for some of you as well. So I did a story with a colleague of mine, Pedrosa, in the Brazilian Amazon about carbon offset projects. And story came out last year, and it was really about how, following up on a lot of reporting that had been done by The Guardian last year that basically sunk Vera, the carbon offset auditor and verification firm, and ultimately led their CEO to resign and force them to completely revamp their methodology in advance of the next climate change COP. But anyways, the point was that there was a lot of shady things going on in the world of voluntary carbon offsets in the Brazilian Amazon and elsewhere. And, in this story, I talked about how many carbon credit projects in the Amazon and throughout the tropics have faced criticism for failing to truly reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Critics argue that these projects overestimate the carbon storage capacity of forests, create credits that sequester carbon that would have been stored even without the project, finance the development of monoculture tree plantations for agriculture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this, of course, is not new for many, if not all of you in the room, but it is for some folks who were learning about this for the first time. Of course, it was based on a lot of work on people that work on REDD+, some of them critics. And, this is the U.S. proud alumnus Talis West's piece of study on the consideration of using geospatial techniques to assess whether or not REDD+ projects in the Brazilian Amazon were actually doing what they claimed to be doing. So then I, in the course of doing my story and then putting it out there to experts, I got, both in the interviewing process and then some feedback from folks after the fact. It was quite interesting. So in the scientific community, in one case, there's a forest ecologist who said, this type of story represents a small fraction of the cases that are successes. If indigenous and traditional populations were to obtain effective land tenure, this too would not lead to afforestation or reforestation per se. This is a myth of community conservation and cannot throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, and then I also got an anthropologist who, in the same breath, and the subsequent feedback, said about my reporting, it's an oversimplification of the dynamics between gender, ethnicity, and community power, dynamics that diminishes agency given the specter of neoliberal hegemony and that reifies carbon credits, when in fact it's capital accumulation and commodification of living beings, human, non-human landscapes that is truly objectionable. So here you go. You have an entirely two different meta discourses at play here, I would argue. And I don't think they necessarily run afoul of each other. I don't think I disagree necessarily with the criticism per se of either that forest ecologist who will go unnamed and the anthropologist who will go unnamed, because I think it's not necessarily a misunderstanding of the basic facts per se, but of the meta discourse and the communication strategy of the work of a news article versus a very extensive and robust scientific study. And so there I am being caught in the middle of a forest fire, and you can likely imagine the outcome. Then, I was fortunate enough to work on a project for Earth Journalism Network that was focused on One Health, and I'm sure most of you know about this concept. It sort of originated with veterinarians, I think, in the 70s, and has sort of spread in many different disciplines. And this idea of sort of intersecting environmental, animal, and human health, especially post-COVID, this became a very large funding obsession. And so we did this project on the impacts of meat on animal, human, and environmental health in the Asia Pacific, where we're actually probably the strongest in terms of our regional programming. And we had a story that was done by an Indian partner about the ravages of the poultry boom in this state in India, Tamil Nadu. And this article was quite extensive. I mean, it was quite in depth. Um, and it basically explored how this poultry boom in Tamil Nadu has led to a number of public health consequences. It's also led to the spread of rabies among local dog populations. It's also ultimately led to a huge amount of pollution from these essentially intensive poultry operations. And it basically linked the narrative using this One Health approach. I had again subsequently. I actually spoke with some individuals, some experts, but in the course I didn't report this story, but the journalist I was editing did. So I had some interactions with both a zoologist who also happens to be an agronomist and a sociologist, and they had similar complaints, right? Much like my carbon credit piece. So the agronomist slash zoologist said this focuses too much on the human story and not enough on the threats to spillover species. During zoonosis, the dimensions of ecosystem health and long-term environmental degradation are not explored. Sociologist says, what are the underlying vulnerabilities of these people? They're scheduled caste or other backward caste in India, living in a regionally marginalized part of India, beset by failed government projects and predatory developmentalism. Gender women are the most affected. This wasn't made clear. So again, I wouldn't, and I don't think Atira would disagree with either of those somewhat, disparate arguments from the zoologist and agronomist and the sociologist. At the same time, the method of delivery and the intended audience for her story for the Wire Science in India is quite different than I would imagine the peer-reviewed journal community for both the sociologists and the agronomists. Again, the discourse, their meta discourses and in this case, a pitiful environmental journalist exploding in a factory poultry operation. So I do want to say that there is, I did mention this before, I have been generalizing quite a bit, and I know that's not what I'm supposed to do in this audience, but just to say that I know there is if we're talking about meta discourses and discourses, there is a discursive difference between, the way the different domains in the sciences and the social sciences and non-social sciences interact, and I'm very aware of that. And we can often talk about how in the social sciences and humanities and anthropology, sociology, human geography, there's much more sort of this trend towards interpretive and descriptive writing that doesn't necessarily operate on the same sort of plane as, for instance, that forest ecologists or the agronomists. And that often gets reduced to this discussion between, the science wars of the 90s, or this debate between hard versus soft sciences that I know TCD has thrown out long ago. But nevertheless, I still think that there is, even between these sort of more discursive or more humanities leaning elements of the social sciences, that there's still obviously a pretty sizable discrepancy with the work that's produced by journalists. Okay, I'm at, and so how much time do I have left?
25 minutes.
25 minutes?
Yeah, but
25 minutes.
We need to leave some time for questions, I guess.
So, okay, so if I have 25 minutes, I'll just go for a little bit more, and then we can go into Q&A if that's all right. Okay. So, why are these differences apparent, and why are they necessary to some degree? I mean, obviously, we're both operating in this. Assuming we take for granted that we're operating in this post-normal universe, there has to be, to some degree, a difference in the work that we do by virtue of our, the professional cultures being very different. The academic route is a very different one from the journalistic one. In order to produce research, robust research anyway, you must go through a form of tutelage in graduate school. If you don't necessarily have to always go to graduate school, but it's more often than not, most work is done in that framework, or at least in a peer-reviewed setting. That is obviously not the case in the media universe. Communication styles are inherently different, whether we're talking about meta discourse or not. Just the way that we interact with our peers and with our audiences is, even in more basic terms, is very different. The audiences that we're speaking to are also very different. Obviously the learned audiences in the scientific world, but even, if you take a step back for a moment and say, much of kind of the praxis versus research discussion that TCD has been having for years now, there's still the essence that, it's about communicating science in much more less technical terms, but still the science itself is what's primary there, what's paramount, right? And that in some sense is still, although the audience may be slightly different, the audience is to some degree still an audience that is focused on the research or the research product um, and results therein. And we already talked a little bit about sort of the roles in society are different as well, even though we may operate in this post-normal setting. People understandably will always view scientists and journalists in entirely different ways because that's the way that they generally view many different professions, even if there are some similarities or in institutions. And I don't necessarily think that will change even as these things bend and merge and amalgamate over time. Um, and in many cases, both are adapting to new media, but in very different ways, both institutions. Um, and yeah, and so these, they have to be different. We shouldn't force fit this relationship or this one sort of uniform kumbaya um, amalgamation of science and journalism, because in some senses these two domains really do have to be quite different because they serve different audiences, and the way that they deliver information, people aren't going to pick a science, as we all know. They're not going to digest a peer-reviewed article in the same way they digest a news article that may reference or gloss some of the science that's been done. I've had a slide that I took out that sort of dissects this in a great level of detail using a couple of case examples. But the bottom line is I don't really need to do that with you all because you know quite well what I'm talking about. If someone were to, to take do a 500 word article or 1,000 word article or short video piece on the research that you do relative to the blood, sweat, and tears that you put into your work and each individual, research product that comes out of it, you of course are going to see inherent differences. And of course, this is going to be part of a delivery of that information that will never change. And it has to serve to some degree. It has to be that way because somebody's not going to necessarily read, you know, um, your well-researched, high impact factor article, and they may much more likely read something that was spread in a via social media feed. So solutions. This is the last bit I'm going to do before we go into questions. But the S word, solutions. I think to some degree, um, I think this is kind of the foundation of that post normal science communication work. But a lot of it is, to me, it amounts to a discussion about where there can be trust between these domains, where there clearly is not a lot of trust at the moment. In both senses, that transparency in both domains, that there's transparency between both sides, if we're really going to sort of create dichotomies, um, respect for each other's work, an understanding to some degree, a literacy discussion of how each profession and the work that goes into it is what is entailed in that. And I think there's actually a lot of work that's already being done to some degree between and I do actually use the word solutions in this case because I think it's some positive things to point to. Um, you know, I think there's been a lot of interactions between journalists and scientists and some high level scientific studies and reports, including the IPCC and the IPBES. And there's, I'm not to plug EJN, although I guess I am plugging EJN. Can be seen to some degree in how there's sort of a more extensive interaction between journalists and some of these high level meetings, both for the climate change COP and the current CBD COP. That's CBD COP and colleague. It's going on as we speak. And that's as much as an effort to understand policy as it is about the underlying science and in a very global and I would say well concerted way. So I think that there's these large scale efforts to bridge some of these meta discourse and to some degree um, um, societal differences that exist between these two domains. There's also a lot of training education for journalists and scientists on shared skills. Some of you are probably familiar with some of these opportunities, both for journalists to understand scientific inquiry better, but also some of the beats that they cover to really actually undertake a project, a scientific project, a research project, and what all is involved in that. So programs like the Environmental Hands-On Research course at the Marine Biological Laboratory, National Tropical Botanical Garden Environmental Journalism Program, the University of Hawaii. And then on the flip side of that, there are efforts by a number of organizations to train scientists to be better communicators in the media realm. So, Compass in the US and in the UK, the Science Media Center, organizations that will work with researchers to essentially become better communicators of their own work and of their domains particularly. There are actually even journalistic stories that essentially involved the direct collaboration between scientists and reporters in a way that is not normal at all, not merely as sources anymore, but as co-creators of stories themselves. So this is a project that has won a number of awards called the Forever Pollution Project about PFAS in Europe, and it was essentially this incredible collaboration between a number of toxicologists, chemists, and others in European universities and investigative journalists throughout Europe. And it created this incredible story and dynamic multimedia project about PFAS. And there's actually, I think, a lot of sort of, I guess you could say, professional practices that I think are bleeding over between the two as well, and in positive ways. Journalists typically, in terms of bylines, they're very covetous of their work and do not like to share bylines on the work that they do, and that's changing quite a bit. And much, I think, to mirror the sort of scientific world of having 50 authors on a peer-reviewed article, to recognize that everybody's work is valuable or should be valued. And I think that's a reflection because of the interactions between these two. And within the journalistic realm, sort of an appropriation, or at least somewhat of an adaptation of scientific methods, including focus on data with the advent of data journalism. And you can see this a lot increasingly with reporting on artificial intelligence and algorithmic bias. A lot of this is, basically using reporting on methodologies, showing your results, essentially using the scientific method and reporting on it in a somewhat more translatable way to those different audiences that we spoke about. And so this is a big thing that's happening, I think. And you can also see it in the work on geospatial research. Remote sensing and GIS used to be very geeky sort of science world suite of technologies, and now it's increasingly being used extensively in journalism. And so, yeah, so I think, there are a number of other factors here or different trends that you can see that are on both sides. And in the scientific world, there is a sense of, using new media technologies, whether it's social media or others, to translate and to purvey information in much in the same way that communicators and journalists would have done in the past. So in some sense, that is an appropriation or an adoption of some of these techniques. And the same case for the part of journalists, they're appropriating some of the techniques and some of the very good things about academic work in knowledge production, i.e., to some degree, the peer review process, fact checking, and the like. So I'm going to leave it there because I wanted to give about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I guess I've left 14 minutes, so I'm more or less on time. But thank you very much. Thanks for letting me drone on.